In the history of human struggle, some battles are fought in silence, hidden behind closed doors where the world rarely looks. But every so often a story emerges so extraordinary, so staggering in its scale, that it captures the attention of millions. This is the story of Rosalie Bradford, a woman whose life would come to symbolize both the darkest shadows of human suffering and the glimmers of resilience that refuse to die. In the early 1990s, America was changing. Fast food restaurants had become part of everyday life, serving bigger meals, sweeter drinks, and endless portions. For many, it was convenience. For others, a slow trap. Obesity rates were climbing at an unprecedented pace, but still, very few people understood just how devastating the condition could become. And then, the world heard the name Rosalie Bradford. By 1986, she weighed more than 200 pounds, over half a ton. She was bedridden, unable to walk, unable to live the life she once imagined. Her body had become both her home and her prison. And in that bed, she would remain year after year, fighting a war against her own flesh. When Guinness World Records listed her as the heaviest woman alive, headlines spread across the globe. The photographs shocked audiences. A single image of her lying in bed, surrounded by pillows, was enough to leave people speechless. But behind those headlines was a human being, a daughter, a wife, a woman with dreams and memories trapped in a body that could no longer carry her. The world gawked, but few understood her pain. Rosalie's existence became a cycle of loneliness and dependence. Every small task, eating, bathing, moving, required assistance. The walls of her home grew taller with each passing day, until the outside world was little more than a distant memory. And so, desperation set in. Rosalie, humiliated and exhausted, once attempted to take her own life. She saw no escape, no path forward. For her, there was only food and silence. But fate had not finished with her story. In 1992, something happened that would change the course of her life forever. A phone call. On the other end was Richard Simmons, a flamboyant, energetic fitness guru known across America. Where others saw only a record-breaking body, Simmons saw a person. He believed Rosalie could change. It was this unlikely connection that sparked one of the most astonishing transformations ever recorded in medical history. Rosalie Bradford would go on to lose more than 900 pounds, over 400 kilograms, a weight loss so dramatic that it too was entered into the Guinness Book of Records, from 200 pounds to under 300. Her body carried scars, her soul carried pain, but her story became a beacon of hope for millions struggling in silence. Yet as with many stories of triumph, Rosalie's tale also carried tragedy. The damage done to her body could never fully be undone. And though she lived to see herself lighter, freer, and admired by many, her life ended far too soon. Rosalie Bradford's journey is more than just numbers. It is the story of America's growing struggle with obesity. It is a reminder that behind every shocking headline, behind every record, there is a human being. And so, tonight, we return to her story, not to stare at a spectacle, but to understand the life behind the record. This is Rosalie Bradford's story. Rosalie Bradford was born in Florida in 1943, in a time when America was still recovering from the Great Depression and the scars of World War II. Families lived with modest means, traditions were strong, and in small towns across the country, daily life was simple. For most, childhood meant running in the streets, going to church on Sundays, and growing up within tightly knit communities. Rosalie's early years gave no sign of the struggles that would one day define her life. She was not a child marked by excess weight, nor by unusual circumstances that might foreshadow her future. In fact, to those who knew her, she seemed unremarkable in the best possible way. A quiet, kind-hearted girl, shaped by the values of family, faith, and community. As she grew into adolescence, she carried with her a strong desire for acceptance and love, dreams not unlike those of millions of other young American women. She wanted stability, companionship, and the chance to build a life with meaning. By the early 1960s, still in her late teens, Rosalie married. For a time, she believed she had found what she was searching for. Marriage was the fulfillment of a hope, and she entered it with optimism. But as years passed, cracks began to appear. Rosalie's marriage did not bring her the happiness she imagined. Conflicts arose, and behind closed doors, she found herself increasingly isolated. Depression began to creep into her life. In a time when mental health was poorly understood and rarely discussed, especially for women in traditional households, Rosalie was left with little support. She carried her sadness in silence, and in that silence, she sought comfort where she could. Food was always present. It was familiar, safe, and dependable. A plate of fried chicken, a slice of pie, or a bag of chips could dull the ache she carried inside. At first, it was occasional indulgence, a way to soothe herself when the weight of her emotions became too heavy. But slowly, food shifted from comfort to dependence. Where others turned to friends, hobbies, or counseling, Rosalie turned to meals. The United States of the 1960s and 70s provided fertile ground for such dependence. Processed foods were booming. Supermarkets overflowed with colorful boxes, frozen dinners, and sugary drinks that promised convenience and pleasure. Fast food chains like McDonald's and Burger King were rapidly expanding, embedding themselves into the culture of everyday life. And so what began as small escapes for Rosalie became a growing habit, reinforced by the very environment around her. By her 20s, Rosalie began gaining weight steadily. Friends noticed, family noticed, but weight gain was often brushed aside, explained away as just a phase or something she would fix later. Yet for Rosalie, each pound carried more than just physical mass. Each one seemed to add to her sense of failure and loneliness. The heavier she became, the more she withdrew from the world, and the more she relied on food to cope with the isolation she felt. The cycle deepened. Depression led to overeating. Overeating led to weight gain led to shame, and shame led back to depression. Few people around her recognized the severity of what was happening. In those decades, obesity was often misunderstood, reduced to simple ideas of willpower or laziness, rarely acknowledged as a complex condition tied to emotional and social struggles. Rosalie, like so many others, internalized the blame. She believed her growing body was her failure alone, a visible mark of her inability to control herself. Rather than seek help, she hid. Social gatherings became rare, outings became difficult, and gradually her world shrank. By the time she reached her 30s, Rosalie was no longer simply a woman who had gained a little weight after marriage. She was already living with morbid obesity. The body that once carried her freely was now slowing down, resisting movement, demanding more and more effort just to perform the simplest tasks. Climbing stairs became exhausting. Walking short distances left her breathless. Each step was a reminder of the trap that was closing around her. The human body is resilient, but it also carries memory. Every habit, every choice, every emotional wound leaves a mark. For Rosalie, her body had become a record of her pain. Each added pound told a story of loneliness, of nights spent eating in silence, of days spent avoiding mirrors, of years passing without the change she longed for. Yet despite the growing difficulties, life moved forward. Rosalie continued in her marriage, continued in her community, outwardly fulfilling the roles expected of her. Inside, however, the battle raged on. Depression and weight gain had become inseparable companions. By the end of the 1970s, she had already gained hundreds of pounds. What began as an invisible struggle had now become undeniable. Family members and neighbors whispered. Strangers stared. Rosalie was no longer simply overweight. She was different, marked, her size making her the subject of both curiosity and pity. Still, the full scale of what was to come was not yet clear. At this stage, she was not bedridden, not yet confined completely by her size. She could still move, still live in the world, though with great difficulty, but the trajectory was already set. Without intervention, without support, her body would continue to expand. And so, the seeds of the tragedy were planted. In her youth, Rosalie was not born into extraordinary circumstances. She was not destined for notoriety. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary woman, carrying ordinary dreams. But through a painful mixture of emotional wounds, cultural shifts, and the silent weight of loneliness, she was already stepping onto the path that would lead her to become, decades later, one of the most shocking figures in the history of obesity. Her story had only just begun. By the late 1970s, Rosalie's life had begun to revolve around a single axis, her weight. What once seemed like a temporary problem had grown into a permanent shadow, shaping her daily routines, her emotions, and even her relationships. The pounds had accumulated relentlessly, year after year, and her body now carried not only mass, but also the visible proof of her inner struggles. Everyday activities became battles. Walking short distances left her out of breath. Chairs strained under her, clothing no longer fit, forcing her into specially made garments. Each trip outside the house became an ordeal filled with stares, whispers, and cruel laughter. For Rosalie, the world outside her door grew hostile, and so she began to retreat further inward. At home, food continued to serve as her only reliable comfort. When sadness pressed down on her, a large meal could lift her mood, at least for a moment. But the relief never lasted, and the guilt that followed only deepened her dependence. Depression and food formed an unbreakable cycle, one feeding the other until neither could be separated. The culture around her did little to help. America in the 1980s was rapidly becoming the land of supersized meals, all-you-can-eat buffets, and cheap processed foods. For many, the convenience of fast food was irresistible. For someone like Rosalie, who was already fighting an internal war, this environment was devastating. The calories were endless, and the temptation constant. As her body grew heavier, Rosalie's world grew smaller. Outings became rare. She began to avoid friends, neighbors, and even family gatherings, ashamed of her appearance and exhausted by the effort it took just to leave her home. She no longer fit comfortably into cars or public spaces. Her home, once a place of refuge, slowly transformed into a prison. By the early 1980s, Rosalie's mobility was severely restricted. Simple movements required monumental effort. Standing up from bed, walking across a room, or climbing even a single step became painful ordeals. Eventually, her body reached a breaking point. She could no longer support her own weight, and she became confined to her bed. It was here that the spiral reached its most devastating stage. Once bedridden, Rosalie lost nearly all independence. She relied on her husband and occasional caregivers for the most basic needs. Bathing, feeding, even rolling over to prevent sores from forming on her skin. The loss of dignity weighed on her as heavily as the mass of her body. Her isolation deepened. Days blurred into nights, weeks into months. She spent years lying in the same room, staring at the same walls, while her body continued to grow. By the mid-1980s, her weight was estimated at more than about 200 pounds, over half a ton. Doctors who visited her were astonished. Neighbors whispered stories about the woman who had grown too large to leave her home. And eventually, her condition caught the attention of the media. In 1986, The Guinness Book of World Records officially recognized her as the heaviest woman in the world. Her name and photographs were printed in newspapers around the globe. For many, the image of Rosalie lying in bed became a symbol of excess, a curiosity that people gawked at. Some saw her as a warning, others as a spectacle, but few stopped to consider the human being inside the body, the quiet woman with dreams and sorrows who now found herself exposed to the world's judgment. The publicity brought her neither joy nor pride. Instead, it added shame and humiliation to an already unbearable burden. She became not just a woman, but a record, reduced to a number on a page, stripped of the complexity of her life. The world knew her size, but not her pain. In the privacy of her room, despair consumed her. She was trapped not only by her weight, but by hopelessness. At one point, Rosalie even attempted to take her own life, believing there was no way out of the prison her body had become. For her, the future seemed sealed. She imagined herself living and dying in the same bed, her life shrinking to nothing more than the four walls around her. And yet, even as she lay in that state, immobile, humiliated, and despairing, the spiral was not the end of her story. For in the depths of her darkest moments, a small and unexpected lifeline would soon reach her. A voice from the outside world, calling not to mock or to condemn, but to remind her that change, though impossible to imagine, was still within reach. But in the years leading up to that call, Rosalie's life was defined by a slow, relentless descent. Her body, once a vessel of freedom, had become a cage. Her mind, once filled with dreams of love and family, was now consumed by shame. Her existence had collapsed into a single room, a single bed, a single cycle of eating and despair. This was the spiral. The years when hope seemed lost, when her identity was overshadowed by the sheer scale of her body, when even survival felt uncertain. It was in this darkness that Rosalie reached the lowest point of her life. And yet, history would remember not only her fall, but also what happened next. For Rosalie Bradford, as impossible as it seemed, the spiral was not the end, but the turning point before a transformation that would shock the world. By the mid-1980s, Rosalie Bradford's life had already collapsed into silence. She was no longer a participant in the world, but a spectator, confined to her bed, watching life pass by through the narrow frame of her bedroom window. For most people, the world is measured in cities, jobs, and journeys. For Rosalie, it had shrunk to a few feet of mattress and the daily rhythm of eating, sleeping, and enduring the weight of her own body. When her weight was officially recorded at more than 200 pounds, the reality of her condition reached far beyond the walls of her home. In 1986, the Guinness Book of World Records named her the heaviest woman alive. For the first time, her private struggle became public knowledge. Newspapers carried her name. Photographs circulated of a woman whose size seemed beyond imagination. To strangers, she was a headline. To journalists, she was a curiosity. To the world at large, she became the heaviest woman on earth. For Rosalie, the recognition brought no sense of achievement. Instead, it felt like an unmasking. The last pieces of dignity she clung to were stripped away. Her name was now inseparable from a number, her identity reduced to the scale. To many, she was not Rosalie Bradford. She was simply 200 pounds. The attention came with a cruel edge. While some readers reacted with pity, others mocked or ridiculed her. In a society that often viewed obesity as a personal failing, Rosalie's size was seen not as the outcome of suffering, but as the proof of weakness. Strangers felt entitled to judge, to laugh, even to condemn her from a distance. They did not see the depression, the years of isolation, the cycle of despair that had trapped her. They saw only a body, a spectacle. Inside her home, Rosalie felt the sting of that judgment. What little contact she had with the outside world grew more painful. The knowledge that millions of people now knew her only as the heaviest woman deepened her shame. The walls of her bedroom closed in tighter. She avoided mirrors, avoided conversation, and sank further into silence. Her health deteriorated alongside her spirit. Bed sores formed on her skin from years of immobility. Her joints ached under the crushing pressure. Breathing became laborious. Each day carried the weight of not only her body, but also the despair that came with knowing her condition might never change. She lived in constant dependence, requiring assistance with even the smallest tasks. Her husband and a handful of helpers carried the responsibility, but no one could ease the burden of her loneliness. At times, Rosalie's despair reached depths that few could imagine. The Guinness recognition, intended as a record of fact, felt to her like a public declaration of hopelessness. It was not an honor but a sentence, a reminder that the world saw her condition as permanent. For a woman already battling depression, the spotlight of global attention was unbearable. It was during these years that Rosalie attempted to end her life. The details of that attempt were rarely discussed, but the act itself revealed the depth of her pain. For Rosalie, life no longer seemed worth enduring. She saw no path out of her bed, no future beyond the walls of her room, no possibility of reclaiming the life she had lost. To her, the cycle was endless. Eat, sleep, despair, repeat. Yet despite her attempts to surrender to the darkness, her story did not end there. Though she could not yet see it, fate was preparing to intervene in a way that would alter the course of her life forever. But in 1986, and the years that followed, all Rosalie could feel was isolation. She had been thrust into the public eye, but the attention had left her more alone than ever. Her name had become synonymous with obesity, her life reduced to a statistic in a record book. She was the heaviest woman alive. A title that carried no glory, only humiliation. The irony was cruel. The wider the world knew her name, the smaller her actual world became. Fame had not expanded her life. It had shrunk it to the confines of a single room, a single bed, a single story. In those long years of isolation, Rosalie lived in the shadow of her record. She wondered if this was all she would ever be remembered for. She imagined the rest of her life unfolding in the same narrow space until one day her body gave out completely. It seemed inevitable. Her weight was rising, her health was failing, and her spirit was breaking. And yet history has a way of surprising us. For Rosalie, the Guinness record, a symbol of despair, was also the strange key that would one day open a new chapter. Because of that record, her name reached far beyond her small Florida town. And in time, it reached someone who refused to see her as a statistic, someone who believed she was more than the number in a book. But before that lifeline arrived, Rosalie endured the hardest years of her existence. She lived not as a woman, but as a headline, not as a person, but as a record. In the world's eyes, she was the heaviest. In her own eyes, she was invisible. And it was in this paradox, famous yet forgotten, seen by millions yet utterly alone, that Rosalie Bradford reached the deepest point of her isolation. For years, Rosalie Bradford lay in silence, surrounded by four walls that felt more like a cage than a home. Her days were marked by monotony, meals, sleep, brief conversations with her husband or helpers, and the endless weight of hopelessness pressing down on her chest. Her name was in the record books, but her life felt like it was already over. And then, in 1992, something happened that no one, least of all Rosalie herself, could have predicted. A phone rang. On the other end was a voice filled with energy, warmth, and above all, belief. That voice belonged to Richard Simmons. Richard Simmons was a fitness guru unlike any other. At a time when fitness culture often celebrated perfection and discipline, Simmons was flamboyant, emotional, and endlessly compassionate. He wore glittering shorts and tank tops, led high-energy exercise classes to upbeat music, and filled television screens with his enthusiasm. But behind the theatrics, Simmons carried a genuine passion for helping people whom the world had forgotten. The overweight, the outcasts, the ones mocked or ignored by mainstream culture. Somehow, through news articles and the notoriety of the Guinness record, Simmons learned about Rosalie. To most people, she was a statistic, a headline, a record holder. To him, she was a person, and he decided to reach out. At first, Rosalie could hardly believe it. The idea that a celebrity fitness instructor, someone seen by millions on TV, would care about her seemed absurd. She was bedridden, humiliated, and convinced that her life was over. What could a man like Richard Simmons possibly want with her? But Simmons persisted. He called, he wrote letters, and he reminded her again and again of one simple truth. She was not beyond saving. For Rosalie, the calls became lifelines. The sound of Richard's voice broke through the silence of her room. His words carried something she had not felt in years: hope. Where doctors had spoken of limits and where society had spoken of shame, Simmons spoke of possibility. "You can do this, Rosalie," he told her. "You are worth saving. You are more than this body. You are more than this bed." It was the first time in years that someone had looked past the number on the scale and seen her humanity. The process was slow and agonizing. Rosalie did not leap from bed and begin a new life overnight. She was still bedridden, still carrying hundreds of pounds of excess weight, but with Simmons' encouragement, she began to take small steps, or more accurately, small movements. From her bed, she performed limited exercises, stretches, and breathing routines. They were not dramatic, but they were the beginning of something larger: momentum. Food, too, became part of the battle. With medical supervision and guidance from Simmons, she began to alter her eating habits. The endless cycle of indulgence and despair was challenged by structured meals and the promise of change. For the first time in decades, she was not simply eating to survive her emotions. She was eating with a goal, and slowly, the weight began to drop. At first, the numbers were modest. A few pounds here, a few pounds there. But for Rosalie, every pound lost was proof that she was not trapped forever. Her body, though battered, still responded. The spiral that had carried her downward for decades was no longer irreversible. Simmons did not let her give up. Whenever Rosalie felt hopeless, he called again. Whenever she doubted herself, he reminded her that she was stronger than she believed. Their connection was not one of celebrity and fan, but of teacher and student, of friend and believer. The world that once mocked her now began to take notice of her transformation. Doctors marveled at the progress. Neighbors who once whispered now saw something unexpected: a woman fighting her way back from the edge of despair. By the mid-1990s, Rosalie had already lost hundreds of pounds. The Guinness Book, which had once immortalized her as the heaviest woman alive, would soon record her again, this time for something very different: the greatest weight loss ever achieved. From over 200 pounds, she dropped to under 300, a loss of more than 900 pounds, over 400 kilograms. It was a transformation so staggering that it defied imagination. For Rosalie, it was more than a physical change. It was proof that she was not the sum of her mistakes, not the weight of her despair. She had reclaimed her dignity, her willpower, and a measure of control over her life. And yet the scars of her past remained. Years of immobility had damaged her body in ways no diet or exercise could fully undo. Her joints, her circulation, and her skin all bore the cost of decades spent in isolation. She would never be entirely free from the consequences of her past. Still, her story stood as a beacon. In churches, in community centers, and in weight loss groups across America, Rosalie's name became a symbol of hope. If she could lose 900 pounds, perhaps anyone could find the strength to change. It all began with a phone call. a simple connection that reminded her she was not invisible, not hopeless, not beyond redemption. For Rosalie, Richard Simmons was not just a fitness instructor. He was a lifeline, a friend, and the spark that reignited a life many had already written off as lost. The call that changed everything did not just save Rosalie's life. It transformed her into a living testament of what was possible, even from the darkest of places. The years following Richard Simmons' intervention marked the most dramatic chapter of Rosalie Bradford's life. What had once seemed impossible, the idea that she could lose even a fraction of her body weight, was now unfolding day by day, pound by pound. For Rosalie, progress did not come in leaps. It came in small, painstaking steps that tested every ounce of her determination. From her bed, she performed exercises that most would consider insignificant, lifting her arms, flexing her legs, controlled breathing. But to Rosalie, each movement was monumental. Every stretch was a rebellion against the years of stillness. Every repetition a reminder that she had not surrendered completely to her weight. And then came the numbers. At first, the scale dipped slightly, a few pounds lost in the first weeks, then a few more in the months that followed. For a woman whose weight exceeded 1,200 pounds, the early progress seemed almost invisible. But Rosalie did not give up. The calls from Richard Simmons, the encouragement of doctors, and her own spark of determination kept her going. Slowly, the numbers began to accelerate. 50 pounds, 100, 200. Each milestone was a victory, each step a piece of proof that the impossible was within reach. By the mid-1990s, Rosalie had lost more than 500 pounds. The woman who once filled the pages of the Guinness Book of World Records as the heaviest living woman was transforming into something else entirely, a symbol of the greatest weight loss the world had ever recorded. Doctors and specialists were astonished. Medical journals and television programs began to cover her journey. To the public, Rosalie's story was almost mythic. She had gone from the depths of despair, bedridden, suicidal, ridiculed, to an extraordinary figure of resilience and change. Her journey carried a message that echoed far beyond her home in Florida. No matter how deep the pit, it was possible to climb out. But transformation came with challenges. The rapid and massive loss of weight left her body scarred. Her skin, once stretched to its limits, now hung in folds that could not be corrected without surgery. Her muscles, weakened by decades of immobility, struggled to adapt to her new frame. Simple tasks that most people took for granted, walking, sitting comfortably, standing without assistance, were still battles. Yet Rosalie accepted these scars as proof of her fight. Each fold of skin, each ache in her body was a reminder of what she had endured and how far she had come. She knew she would never look like the thin, glamorous women on magazine covers. But that was not her goal. Her goal was life, a life reclaimed from the brink of death. By the late 1990s, Rosalie had lost more than 900 pounds. From 200 pounds down to under 300, she had achieved what no one thought possible. The Guinness Book of World Records returned to her name, not as a symbol of despair, but as a monument of triumph, the greatest recorded weight loss in history. Her story began to inspire others. She received letters from strangers who had seen her transformation and found the courage to begin their own journeys. She spoke at churches and community centers, sharing her testimony not only as a woman who had lost weight, but as a woman who had found faith and purpose. Rosalie, who had once felt invisible and forgotten, was now a beacon for those who believed they too were beyond saving. Her faith became central to her message. Rosalie spoke openly about how her relationship with God had deepened during her struggle. She credited not only Richard Simmons, but also her spiritual awakening for giving her the strength to endure the pain, the loneliness, and the years of self-destruction. To her, her weight loss was not just a physical transformation, but a spiritual rebirth. And yet, even in triumph, Rosalie remained deeply human. She admitted to her weaknesses, her past mistakes, and her ongoing struggles with food and health. She never pretended that her journey was simple or that her victory erased the years of suffering. Instead, she embraced the complexity of her story, a story of pain, redemption, and perseverance. In interviews, Rosalie often reflected on the irony of her legacy. For years, she had been remembered as the heaviest woman alive. Now, she was remembered as the woman who achieved the greatest recorded weight loss. Both titles came from the Guinness Book, but only one reflected who she truly was. Not just a statistic, but a fighter. Her transformation also carried a wider cultural impact. In a society obsessed with appearances, Rosalie's journey challenged the notion that worth was tied to size. She reminded the world that behind every number on a scale was a human being with struggles, dreams, and the capacity for change. Her life became a story not of shame, but of resilience. By the time the Guinness World Records recognized her new achievement, Rosalie had already become something greater than a record holder. She was living proof that even the heaviest burdens could be lifted, that even the deepest despair could give way to hope. The great transformation of Rosalie Bradford was not only measured in pounds lost, but in dignity regained, in the spark of life that returned to her eyes, and in the countless others who saw in her story a reflection of their own battles. She had been to the bottom, the weight of despair crushing her spirit, her body immobilized, her life seemingly over. And from that bottom she had risen, not as a perfect figure, but as a symbol of what human determination, compassion, and faith could achieve. Her story was no longer just about weight, it was about redemption. The years that followed Rosalie Bradford's historic transformation were filled with both triumph and struggle. Her name had been etched into the Guinness Book of World Records not once, but twice. First, as the heaviest woman alive, and later as the individual who achieved the greatest weight loss ever recorded. From the outside, her story seemed complete, the perfect arc of tragedy, redemption, and victory. But life is rarely so simple. Even after shedding more than 900 pounds, Rosalie's body bore the cost of decades of immobility. The extreme weight she had once carried left her with deep physical scars that could not be erased. Her joints had been crushed under the strain for too long, leaving her with chronic pain. Her circulation, weakened by years of poor health, created complications that would never fully heal. The folds of skin left behind by her massive weight loss became medical concerns in themselves, prone to infection and requiring constant care. Rosalie did not hide these struggles. Instead, she spoke openly about them, using her story to warn others about the dangers of unchecked weight gain and the pain of letting despair dictate one's choices. In interviews and church appearances, she reminded her listeners that while weight loss was possible, the consequences of obesity could leave lifelong marks. "You can overcome," she would say, "but it's better to start before the damage is done." Still, she was proud of what she had accomplished. Rosalie traveled to speak at community centers and churches, sharing her testimony not just as a woman who had lost weight, but as a woman who had found God's grace in the darkest of places. Her faith had become the cornerstone of her later years. To Rosalie, her transformation was not only physical, but spiritual. She credited divine strength for carrying her through moments when she felt too weak to continue. Letters continued to pour in. Strangers from across the United States, and even abroad, wrote to her, thanking her for showing them that change was possible. Some had lost weight after hearing her story. Others had simply found courage to face their own personal struggles. Rosalie answered as many letters as she could, offering encouragement and prayer. For people who had once seen her only as a headline, she had become a voice of compassion and hope. But her health remained fragile. Despite her remarkable transformation, the years of strain on her body could not be undone. Medical complications plagued her, and hospital visits became frequent. She continued to fight, but each battle left her weaker. By the early 2000s, Rosalie was still celebrated as a living legend in the world of weight loss, but her health had entered a slow decline. In 2006, after years of fragile health, Rosalie Bradford passed away at the age of 63. Her death was mourned not only by her family and friends, but by countless strangers who had been touched by her story. Rosalie's legacy, however, did not end with her passing. Her name remains immortalized in the Guinness World Records. More importantly, her journey continues to circulate in documentaries, books, and online communities dedicated to weight loss and personal transformation. She is remembered not simply as the heaviest woman, or even as the woman who lost the most weight, but as someone who proved that it is never too late to fight back against despair. Her story raises difficult questions about health, society, and the way we view obesity. For some, she is a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring weight and emotional health. For others, she is a symbol of faith and resilience, proof that even when life seems impossible, there is still a chance for redemption. In the end, Rosalie Bradford's life cannot be summarized by numbers alone. Yes, the numbers were staggering. 1 to 200 pounds at her heaviest, more than 900 pounds lost. But behind those statistics was a woman who struggled, who suffered, who found hope, and who inspired others. Her final years were not free of pain, but they were filled with meaning. She had taken the humiliation of her past and turned it into a platform for encouragement. She had transformed from a recluse hidden in her bedroom to a voice heard across the country. And though her body could not fully recover from the damage of obesity, her spirit had triumphed. Rosalie once said that she hoped her life would remind people of one simple truth: it is never too late to change. That message became her gift to the world. Today, when her name is spoken, it carries with it not just the weight of records, but the weight of resilience. She will always be remembered as the woman who defied the odds, who rose from despair, and who showed that even from the lowest point, transformation is possible. Her legacy lives on in the pages of record books, in the hearts of those she inspired, and in the timeless truth that every human being, no matter how broken, has the capacity for redemption.